So, okay, well, welcome everybody. Switch over here to speaker mode. Hopefully I'll remember to switch back to gallery. So welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. And just wanted to go ahead and hop through the solar news for the week. And then after that, if anybody has any questions, any issues you want to bring up, then that will be a good time for it. And then we're going to jump in. And today we're going to talk about some of the issues facing EV charging. I was just at a conference last week, and this was a big discussion point, something I hadn't considered about how demand charges are going to be so dramatically impacted by companies putting in EV charging to the point where under the current system may make it really impractical to do EV charging. So we'll discuss that. And then I asked Tony to join since he's our resident expert on EV chargers. So we'll jump into that. Okay, so the solar news this week, well, 240 companies have joined in with CEA. CEA is the Solar Energy Industries Association, and they have asked the Commerce Department to drop the investigation about dumping of solar panels here in the US from Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. If you'll recall, this investigation, I think it was what, AXA or the company, domestic company filed saying, hey, we think that these companies, which are Chinese owned, are just trying to avoid the Chinese tariffs by going through these 4 countries. And kind of the industry was like, duh, you think? But anyway, if they were found guilty of this, then customers of purchasers of these panels could face up to a 200% tariff penalty on their purchase. So what happened was immediately people just stopped buying those panels. They couldn't afford that kind of risk. So then the Biden administration stepped in because we lost about 80% of our supply chain and said, listen, we're not going to impose these penalties or deal with that part of it for 2 years as this investigation goes forward. Well, the investigation is going forward. Their preliminary results are due on December 1st of this year, with the final report due on May 1st of next year. But the companies have come forward and said, listen, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act really kind of makes this whole thing moot. So why don't we just drop the whole thing, pretend it never happened, and let's not be disruptive to the solar industry. So that's where we stand at the moment on that. To sort of emphasize the point that there were a lot of companies that are doing solar manufacturing now in the US because of the 10% kicker on the investment tax credit as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. You have like NL North America, which is an Italian manufacturer, has announced they're going to open a 3 to 6 gigawatt panel manufacturing facility here in the US. First Solar announced a 3.5 gigawatt Alabama facility that they're adding into their 3 Ohio solar facilities, which brings their workforce up to about 3,000 people working for that company. Translucent Energy Partners is partnering with Philadelphia Solar, which is a Jordanian manufacturer of solar panels. Didn't even know there was such a thing, but they're opening up a 1.2 gigawatt facility here in the US. And to give you a sense of scale, 23 gigawatts of solar was installed in 2021. So if you add these 3 that I just mentioned this week, that's almost 10 gigawatts, of almost half. You know, with growth and everything, each week we seem to get more and more and more. So certainly all of the US is gearing up for domestically manufactured solar. We don't necessarily know what constitutes that, but you know, whether the cells, the silicon, the assembly, how that's going to work, we're still waiting on the IRS to let us know those rules. Amazon has announced they're going to start training employees in solar installation. They have a program they call Career Choice, where Amazon pays tuition costs for employees. This is going to be a 10-week course. offered through Strata Tech Educational Group, paid for by Amazon. And this just sort of emphasizes the fact that the growth of solar is going to mean the growth of workforce development. I see Chris here on the call, and Chris teaching down at Marietta College. Just an example, all of the colleges, all the community colleges, trade schools, going to have to gear up for a tremendous workforce expansion. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is projecting about a 27% growth next year. That's significant, although the US government's always been good at under projecting solar requirements. So we'll see how that works. And I guess the question is, will people realize they've got to get this kind of training? You know, we know in the industry, we need these folks, but will they get the training? At this conference I was at, essentially all of the installers, all the manufacturers, all the different consulting companies were running around looking for students who were in attendance saying, hey, we'll hire you. You know, I mean, drop out of school, come to work for us. You know, so not so great for the colleges if all the companies are saying you don't have to finish your degree, we'll just hire you straight out. But that's the reality. If they can fog a mirror, you know, they're gonna get hired at the moment. Okay, Jinko, there's a number of new records in efficiency on silicon panels. Jinko Solar just announced that they've got a 23.86% efficient panel, then outdone almost immediately by Longi. Longi has announced a 26.81% efficient, which broke their record back in March of 25.47. So we're starting to see all of these solar panels starting to creep up towards that, what is it, the Shockley quasar limit. For a single junction panel, it's around 30, 31, 32%. Now they're starting to put in some perovskite, double junction kind of things, which is pushing that up. But we're fast approaching the 30% efficient solar panel world, which is pretty amazing. And then this was my favorite news of the week. Texas, you know, has had a lot of trouble with their electric grid, and pretty much every 3 years they have a major winter freeze or a summer extraordinary heat wave that then causes their grid to crash. And so they decided to hire a consultant, a California consulting firm, paid them $600,000 to study the grid. How can they essentially bulletproof it so that it will be more resilient? Unfortunately, the study does not consider weather as a factor, which seems pretty quite an oversight, considering it's the weather that causes most of these problems. And they also make the assumption that all forms of fossil fuel will be available to them at any time in unlimited quantities. So the last event was essentially that everything froze up and all the natural gas pipelines froze up and there was no natural gas. The piles of coal froze up, so you couldn't actually scoop it out to put it into the boilers. The wind turbines froze up. So you know, and the weather. So you're not considering the weather and you're not considering fuel shortages. But other than that, the grid will be pretty resilient. So no wonder this grid never gets fixed. But anyway, that seems to be a typical process that we see in government. So anyway, that's the news from the solar industry. So any questions, any discussion on things to add? Nope, everybody's quiet there. All right. So why don't we jump in then to our discussion point? What we're looking at here is I wanted to discuss about as solar EV charging, not necessarily solar, but just EV charging becomes a bigger and bigger thing. The question that I'm posing here is, will utility policies, the current utility policies, basically present a barrier to this happening? For those of you who have been on the calls in the past, I like to sort of project out and say, All right, we've got all of these electric vehicles that are being connected to the grid for charging. And that will form this massive battery backup system. So we begin the world of virtual utilities, virtual power plants. You can do load leveling. There's a lot of things you can do when you connect these EV battery banks to the grid. But there are some issues that we have to address. Otherwise, it just ain't going to happen. The two big issues that were raised at this conference had to do with the way demand charges are handled on commercial billing, and also the issue of utility ownership. So what I thought it'd do is give you a real quick recap of what the issues are as I see them, and then ask Tony to chime in to maybe tell us some of the issues, since he lives and breathes this every single day. So the first thing, there's some of the things that are beginning to happen as people are seeing that there is a need for EV charging in a big way. Well, the Biden administration, just allocated $5 billion, hoping to install 500,000 charging stations. It's a nice way to prime the pump. It's going to start some projects going. Not really sure how these are being awarded, but that's a goal. Now, Ohio, where I live, I just thought this was kind of a funny goal, that their goal in Ohio is 90% of the population will live within 25 miles of a charging station. Struck me a little bit like 25, like 90% of Ohioans will live within 25 miles of a telephone. I don't quite know how helpful that's going to be. You pretty much need one where you are. And another factor to bear in mind is currently with gasoline, about 80% of all the gas sold in the country is through convenience store / gas stations. So if EV charging is going to follow that model, we need to have some way that these kind of commercial enterprises can efficiently and effectively install charging stations and somehow make a profit. That's at least under our current model of fueling vehicles. That's the mechanism we're used to. And the question is, will that work under the way that these bills are typically constructed? Now, there was a recent study by the Rocky Mountain Institute, shows that when you use a charging station, about 90% of the cost of the electricity will be in demand charges. And some of you already know what I'm talking about there. Others don't. I'll explain that a little bit further. And then the other issue is, if the utility companies are going to get into the business of charging electric vehicles, owning charging stations, charging for charging stations, well, the demand charging function and all of that is because of their policies. So essentially, they don't fall under their own policies. It doesn't really affect them, the demand charge issue. And secondly, will they be able to use ratepayer money to subsidize this in an unfair competition kind of way? So that's going to be a big issue, a big fight between utilities and people who are trying to use charging stations as a profit center. So let me explain a little bit about demand charges. So what is a demand charge? So I've got this kind of fake sample electric bill for a commercial enterprise. And the way that the commercial enterprises typically work is you're charged maybe a basic access fee. In this case, that's just being denoted as $23. And then you're charged for the kilowatt hours that you're consuming. So that's 16 cents and some change per kilowatt hour. So we've got 3,778. Now, those of you who do just residential, that's familiar to that point. But then demand charges are for usually a 15-minute increment based on the most energy that you're drawing during that 15-minute increment during the course of a month. So in this example, they've got two different demand charges. One is during peak load periods, and then the other is during off-peak periods. So under this peak load, they're saying this customer here had a peak load demand of 500 kilowatts. So for a 15-minute period, they were drawing 500 kilowatts for at least 15 minutes. It could be longer, but it's got to be at least 15 minutes. That just avoids surges and things like that. All right, they charge you $17 or $7.13 per kilowatt hour, or kilowatts, not kilowatt hours. So the demand charge on this bill was $3,565 for the peak level. So the rationale there, I just threw some math up here. If they consume that amount of energy, 23,245 kilowatt hours over the course of a month, and they did that on a, the same amount of energy, 24 hours a day, 30.5 days a month, they would be considering at an hour, or consuming at an hourly rate of 31.75 kilowatts. That would be the level they're drawing. That would be the infrastructure that would be required from the utility to get that amount of power to them if they consumed it at a constant rate. But nobody consumes electricity at a constant rate. I shouldn't say nobody, but it's very atypical. So here they're saying, okay, for 15 minutes, we had to give you 500 kilowatts. So we've got to bill you for the infrastructure to get you that 500. Doesn't matter, that you don't use that very much. We still had to provide that infrastructure. So in this example, their cost of electricity was about $3,800. Their demand charges were about, looks like about 4,300. So the demand charges were actually more than the cost of the electricity. And then the total bill is $8,000 and some dollars. So just to explain how demand charges work, and this is fairly typical. Now, if I were to install one fast charging station at my convenience store, let's say that's the bill for the convenience store, and a fast charger, I looked up some of them, and an example I pulled out was a 350 kilowatt, 920 volt DC charging station. Charging station itself supposedly costs between $12,000 and $35,000. If the demand charge from this utility is $7.13, and I happen to have one person over the course of the month charge for 15 minutes, I've just added $2,500 to my electric bill. So just one person using one charging station one time during the month just cost me as a business owner $2,500. That obviously you're not going to charge that customer anywhere near that. So this is not going to be a profit center. Hopefully that charging station will be used more, but more than one time, but you'll still have those demand charges. And then on top of that, the cost of the electricity that's being consumed. Now imagine that you're trying to install 10 charging stations at a convenience store. You might see under this example, an extra $25,000 a month in demand charges. So those are some of the issues there that we're talking about. Yeah.
Hey, I was curious, Tom, what does I know this is just an example you had, but let's say the grocery store, how much proportionally, I mean, if one charging station is 350 kilowatts, what does the grocery store have as a max anyway? Is it like 100 or 200, or are you saying that this is an extra 350 on top of whatever they're already?
Yeah. Yeah, that's all I did is whatever it was, you're adding $350 to your maximum, to your demand charge. Okay, or 350 kilowatts. I mean,
their normal max charge would have to hit the same time as the charging station to be cumulative like that.
Yes. Assuming that, and I suspect that would be fairly possible.
Probably middle of the day, I would expect so too. I mean, well, unless at night when they turn on the lights on it. I just don't know what runs the grocery store. Is it the refrigerators, or is it the what runs their electricity charge? Right.
It's going to vary depending on the customer, depending on the facility. And I tried to look up, I did a search trying to see, is this $7? This was an example of a bill that I found. Is that normal? Is that typical? And I could not find, I mean, electric bills are not very transparent. So I was looking up rate structures, Ohio rate structures, AEP rate structures, couldn't find an example I did see some other people throwing out a $10 demand charge per kilowatt. You know, so I guess I just kind of assume $7, but there are others who may have personal experience on that know what they're being charged, but it's kind of all over the place, I suspect. So Tony, why don't you chime in, give us your perspective and tell everybody if anything that I just said was wrong.
No, Jay, I think it's quite the opposite. It's probably the best, most clear explanation of peak demand charges that I've ever seen. I think hopefully one of the things that it demonstrated was how insane that alters a organization's energy bill, right? Literally doubles it, depending on, you know, usage at certain intervals of time. Now, this is true with EV charging, which is the real point of this, but it's obviously also true with just normal operations, right? Peak demand charging exists depending on what you do. If you need to run a machine that's pretty energy intensive, you'll get that spike. And that's an issue for a lot of organizations that we've talked with, was like, hey, I don't even care about EV charging. Can you do something to help me reduce my peak demand charges, right? Which, you know, we feel pretty strongly is the silver bullet there is a combination of on-site energy generation and energy storage, right? That's how you solve that problem. Mm-hmm. As it relates to EV charging, again, it's refreshing. It's refreshing to hear from you kind of how you see this problem, because it's one that we've been very focused on for quite some time. Let me, if I can share my screen, I'll just kind of to give everyone an example of like tangible example of what this means. I'll just pull up EVgo. It doesn't have to be EVgo, it can be any kind of public charging company, but to kind of give everybody an idea. Okay, so here at the bottom, blue is early bird. And those are for the early risers of us who want to charge between midnight and 8 a.m. in the morning. Off peak is between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. and then again at 8 p.m. to midnight. And then on peak, the red, from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. Okay, so you can kind of see, just this is an EVgo pricing to kind of set the context to go a little bit deeper. How much these things fluctuate kind of based on what plan you have, right? Some pretty drastic changes, but obviously nothing that's as egregious as, you know, multiple dollars per kilowatt hour. Now, I kind of showed that to, there's some other studies, and I won't nerd out here, but this was studied out in the west of the country on peak demand charges for electric vehicles. I can just drop this chat in the link if anyone is nerdy enough to read it. There's some interesting information there, but it's essentially a lot of what Jay was saying. No one is taking into account the peak demand charges. What's further complicating this is that peak demand charges are not treated equally everywhere in the country, right? So depending on what region that you fall in, you have different sweetheart deals, different exemptions. We're seeing across the country, there's a wide variety of different kind of how aggressive utility companies are as far as what, some of them don't want to own it at all, some want to go all in. Jay, I think you did an excellent job of highlighting the obvious problem, conflict of interest and further monopoly of if Warmkey Energy has already a quasi monopoly over our region, and then Tony Charging wants to build public charging infrastructure, there's no way that I will ever be able to compete with you, because you can just simply exempt yourself from peak demand charges and send them over to us. I think another thing that you highlighted, and this is kind of a little bit of a deeper conversation. In my humble opinion, it has always been an error to try to replicate the gasoline model of putting electrons in your transportation. To try and shorten that distance to replicate the time it takes at a traditional gas pump is a fool's errand from kind of a variety of perspectives. So the first is, one of the great benefits of having an electric vehicle is that you don't have to go somewhere else for your electrons for your transportation, right? So like that's like a huge deal. The fact that we're trying to replicate the old gas station model with electric vehicles is really dumb to me. The second thing is that in order to even have a chance of charging at that rate, so 350 kilowatts and above, one, most vehicles currently can't even take that. They will not, like the battery will not allow you to push energy to it at that rate. Because it's an insane amount of energy. The other problem is it's incredibly expensive. 350 kilowatt charger is incredibly expensive. To say nothing of the grid upgrades that you need to put it in to step up the energy from the grid to push it that way, right? So, and then I think the final nail in the coffin is the peak demand charges, Jay, as you pointed out. So, like for those three reasons. One, why the hell are we replicating going somewhere else for our energy for transportation? That's dumb. We should not do it. Two, why are we trying to push? Why are we spending an ungodly amount of money in EVSC, like the actual equipment for charging vehicles, the upgrades to be able to drop it, transformer upgrades, things that you have to do to be able to do that, all to push energy at a rate that most cars can't take, and then also deal with the peak demand charges at the back end, right? So to me, this is like very clearly not the right direction to go as it relates to EV charging. I don't think the right model, if we can even use like cell phones as an example, the right model is charge where kind of ever it's easiest for you to charge, and not like bring your phone down to 1% and then try to juice it up in 30 seconds. Like that's kind of a weird way of solving this problem. It's an incredibly expensive way of solving this problem. And because of that, it ultimately does not solve it, right? So I think if this is far more about lower power EV chargers in more places than these ridiculous kind of monuments to the past where we have to go to a specific location to get that much juice and get wrecked financially in the process, right? I laughed when you showed that statistic of Ohio, 90%, so not even 100%, right? 90% of Ohio within 25 miles. Well, that means if you're on the outer edge of that, you are traveling a round trip of 50 miles in a battery, in a vehicle that might only have, 250 or 300 miles of range. And you're going to spend 50 miles going to a charging station, however they're defining that, right? I'm assuming that's supercharging stations, at least I'm hoping it's supercharging stations from a public infrastructure perspective and not any kind of charging. But, with Ohio, you're never sure.
Yeah, let me throw this open. I'm going to go in here to gallery view here, and hopefully we can get some folks, chiming in, because I guess my question was, as I was thinking about this, yeah, it's clear that the infrastructure, like you're saying, if we're wanting folks to just stop at your local, Circle K or whatever and charge up along the highway, that's pretty impractical. I personally can charge at home. The question becomes, like on a long trip, how are you going to pull in, recharge? Or for people who are running, semi trucks, let's assume those guys go to a electric format. How do they charge? I asked some people. I met a guy who this is what he does. He does consulting for charging stations at convenience stores. And I said, well, how did you solve this problem? He goes, I don't. I tell them their bill will triple or quadruple. And it's like, okay, well, there's a solution. That doesn't sound like a good one.
Greatest consulting answer I've ever heard.
Yeah, I know. And so then you've got, like, it struck me that maybe there are big old semi trailers of batteries you can swap out, just bring one into a truck stop. When it depletes, it's like changing out a double, a D cell battery or something. You just pop that one, take it back to a solar farm, recharge it, throw a new one in, and deal with it that way. I don't know. What solutions do you have, Tony? Because you're going to be, you're the next Elon Musk of EV charging here.
Well, this is kind of exactly, we learned a lot of this stuff when we studied it pretty deeply a few years ago. There's no question on our team that the way to solve this problem is a combination of generating your own energy on site and storing it on site, right? That solves a lot of other problems than just the peak demand charges, but it also solves the peak demand charges. So let me give you kind of a very specific, although nerdy example. Usually it's cost prohibitive for even folks to deploy 150, forget a 350, but 150 kilowatt charger. A lot of that money is really in the additions and upgrades that you have to make to the grid to be able to step up that power to push at that rate. And so a way to solve that problem is, rather than needing to go kind of the traditional 100% grid tied 150 kilowatt charger, a way that we get after solving that problem is pairing that charger with probably between 160 and 170 kilowatt hours of battery, and ideally, put it under a solar canopy or have some way to do renewable energy and on-site energy generation. And in this model, you can upgrade kind of existing slow 3, 5, 7 kilowatt glorified extension cord AC chargers by refilling that big battery, but then being able to discharge at supercharging rates without ever having to pull that from the grid at any time.
Wow.
Right? So you can still, so you're pushing 150 kilowatts at a time of juice to a vehicle, but the grid is never feeling that, and you're not paying for that, right? Now, there needs to be a little bit more in-depth analysis as far as like very site specific, as far as like how many cars are you predicting are going to come and at what times of day. But the advantage of doing it that way is, I think, kind of multifold. First, it's not, you don't need to do the construction and the grid upgrades. You're also avoiding peak demand charges. You can drip refill that battery, whether it's using solar or using energy from the grid at non-peak times, to refill that tank and then discharge it at supercharging rates, right? So like that's one way to get after the problem. And it's really the only way, one of the only ways to do it if you're talking about, places that are pretty regressive in their utility, areas that are pretty regressive in their policies. Another thing, and you brought this point up, and I think it's a great point. I've been doing a little bit of work with folks who are studying the megawatt charger, right? So for semis, and what does that look like? And the consensus is pretty nearly exclusively some kind of energy storage, right? Some say hydrogen, some say lithium ion, whatever. We can argue about the chemistries, I don't really care, but it's using energy storage kind of in the same concept, where you can have a big old tank of energy that you're replenishing from a variety of different sources. And then you can still discharge at, supercharging, in that case, like megawatt charging rates, without crashing the grid. Because, right, the other awkward side of this that did not come up in conversation up until this point is, as we tether our electrified transportation to a fragile and failing grid system, what happens when the grid shuts down, right? Probably not great things. So if you have a solely grid tied 150 to 350 kilowatt charger, it's really true for any amount of chargers, but particularly on the supercharging side, the grid goes down probably because of the blackout or brownout that you solved or you created by trying to push that amount of juice at any given time. You then not only bring down your electricity, your power for your society, your city, but also you bring it also impacts your transportation as well, right?
Sure.
So,
I could envision when you're saying that, let's say a hurricane is approaching Florida, everybody drives electric vehicles. Well, right now they all run up and buy out the liquor store and fill up their tanks with gas. Well, now they're all going to go into the EV stations. So everybody plugs in all at the same time. The voltage on the grid drops, the grid crashes in advance of an oncoming storm, and you get these cascading crashes, and you could be adding to that problem, because the more you're drawing, the lower the voltage is going to be on the system. And then, of course, once it falls outside of its operational range. So
exactly right.
Severe events could cause that crash.
And that's why we've kind of deliberately, when we think about charging in our charger, we've built in solar inverter and battery inverter, because we view that as central to the charging process. Because if you can incorporate solar directly into the charging, not the current weird way, kind of ridiculous way of generate, photon hits panel, goes to DC, gets flipped to AC, pushed to the grid, bye-bye electron. Rando electron gets pulled from the grid, AC, flipped to DC, either with the DC charger or the onboard charger of the vehicle. It's kind of ridiculous. If you have an outage, you're still not safe. From our perspective, it's like, let's take a distributed energy generation asset and go direct solar to the car, DC to DC. Not only is more efficient, but in the event of a grid outage, you're still fine. If you want to, also incorporating energy storage into that mix, so that you have a couple options. You can go solar to car or battery to car, use solar to charge the battery and then push it to the car. And so that's literally why we did what we've done, is because when we looked at what does the future of EV charging look like, what are going to be the problems, there's a cost problem, there's a complexity problem, there's a energy security and reliability problem. And in order to solve all of these things, again, we think that the only real solution is that more seamless integration of being able to generate energy on site, store it on site, and then charge your vehicle.
Right. Okay. Does anybody else have a question for Tony, or as we're discussing this? We've been kind of monopolizing the conversation. Give everybody a chance.
I've got a couple of observations and then a question. One, I've seen commercial bills in Texas. I don't remember the upcharge for peak usage. I'll have to go back and see if I can find one, see if we have those here. But our local grocery store had 4 EVgo chargers, and then about a year ago they installed 8 to 10 Tesla chargers. And they are being utilized 100% of the time. There's a line for people to charge their vehicles. And what's really interesting is the profile of the people in the vehicles aren't the market you would think that would be Tesla buyers. It's a very different profile. I'm not sure if these are Lyft or Uber drivers or what the purpose is, but anyway, at least someone has figured this out in our market. And there's 15 chargers at this local grocery store, and 100 per. The EVgo aren't used as much, but the Tesla chargers are 100% utilized. The question I have is about residential charging systems and the smarts available for those. For example, the M-phase chargers or the other chargers coming out, are they able to look at your battery system and rates and your overall system and choose when to charge and when not to charge, et cetera, et cetera? How much smarts are being put into the residential chargers to address some of the issues that Tony has brought up?
Yeah. Hey, Tony, do you have insight into that? I can.
Yeah. So the short answer is it varies between dumb bricks and some pretty kind of intelligent designs. I think, and I hope I'm not being overly critical here, it is not where one would think it should be, right? As far as, because it's not like super complicated to do this, right? So when we roll out with our residential spinoff of what we're doing first with commercial, all of that will kind of be baked into that. The other reason it's easier for us to do that is because we're incorporating solar and storage into that as well. So if we have to do it on the solar and storage side anyway, it's a lot easier for us to then apply it to the EV charging side. Not all, this is not surprising to anyone on this call, not all residential chargers are created equally, right? Most are just junk that have somebody's label slapped on, from China. And some are a lot more intelligent, right? So like the vehicle itself, so Tesla as an example, the vehicle itself, you can say when you want to charge it, right? So, hey, I want you to charge it from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. and that's all I'll need, right? So this can both be charged. A way to solve this problem is both on the vehicle side and on the charger side, right? So as long as you have it plugged in, the car can say, and this again also varies with make and model of vehicle, but the car can say, hey, I'll accept a charge at this time, just plug me in, and I'll wait until that time to charge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and I was also thinking that a lot of these load management systems that are being incorporated into buildings, you could just simply manage that circuit similarly to without relying on the charging station. You can just program that to say, okay, turn that circuit on or off, you know, at these times. But I know what Tony was saying, most of the vehicles do incorporate some sort of smart charging aspect to it, whether it's whether, you know, we've talked about if you're going from AC charging the vehicle and the inverter is housed in the vehicle, then you're basically your charging station is just an extension cord, you know, so it doesn't have to be that smart. So, and any other questions? Yeah, Meg.
Well, I was just going to say that we worked briefly on some concepts with a client who was co-locating. The plan was to co-locate charging stations for like semi trucks with data centers, and they were data center developers, and they somehow saw synergy there. And I think the data centers are very sophisticated in the way they get power, lots of power, and they also have backup power, 100% backup power, you know, with generators and so forth. And they had a solar canopy, you know, concept that they wanted to do. So anyhow, I was just going to throw that out there. They were going to put in like kind of like a coffee type lounge space for truckers to come in. They thought that they're charging. They had told us that the charging would take about 20 minutes to charge a semi. So I assume that's for, I'm not familiar with all the units and, you know, the science behind the power, you know, to the trucks, but they were pretty aggressively seeking to put lots of these in internationally in Europe as well as in the US. And so I just thought I'd throw that out there. Somebody's been thinking about it in those terms. And I have kind of a rendering I can share if you of one of them that they had, just kind of concepts if you.
Sure, if you want to throw that up. Well,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Can you see that?
there we are. Yep.
So this was their little kind of coffee shop type place, and these were all solar canopies. These are all the, you know, they could house that many semi trucks. This was intended to be for semi trucks, and this was the data center. And then these are all the transformers and things that serve the data center. So I thought it was interesting. We didn't get too far with it, but yeah, you can kind of see what they were thinking.
Uh-huh.
So that's out there. Somebody smarter than me was already looking at that.
Okay, great. All right, Tony, did you have a response? I thought you were going to say something there.
Yeah, so two real quick ones. The first is just beware, there's a lot of greenwashing afoot as it relates to showcasing what appears to be renewable energy in the vicinity of charging. Therefore, any normal person looks like, hey, this is 100%, like this is coming from the sun, right? And I'm not saying that was the case here, but to give you everyone on this call kind of an idea. In order to generate about 30 kilowatts of solar, 30 kilowatt solar canopy, and there's fluctuations, but just as kind of a rule of thumb, it'll extend over about 8 parking spaces, okay? And that'll give you, depending on your multiple and where you're at in the United States, to say multiply it by 5, that'll give you 150 kilowatt hours of sun drops every day. If you have a megawatt or multiple megawatt chargers underneath that thing, that is very clearly not generated exclusively by the sun, right? It's also worse. I've been made aware of some rather unfortunate case of greenwashing where they use solar panels, legit solar panels, for their LED lights in the canopy. and then everything else is literally black glass, right? So it's like there's a wide variety of greenwashing happening. One is like, hey, we're trying, but not like this is a single digit percentages of the energy that we actually need, all the way to like pretty much downright frauds. The last thing I'll say, and this goes back to like the philosophy of like super mega cool guy, fast ultra charging, is that, you know, billions and billions of dollars are spent every year to capture our attention and to, you know, whether it's eyeballs or get us to go place and spend amount of, you know, even minutes someplace. And so the other weird thing that I think is happening here is we're going to spend a whole bunch of, like a convenience store as an example, we're going to spend a tremendous amount of money and headache and pain and do things that don't make any financial sense to shorten the time that someone spends in their location. So I think what is also happening right now, and I'm working with a few kind of folks on this idea, is to kind of rethink, hey, if you need to charge somewhere else that's not in your home or your apartment complex or your work, this other destination, kind of reimagining what that experience includes, and to kind of, you know, hey, if you've got somebody captured there for like an hour, that might actually be a really good thing for an organization to keep butts in seats, than trying, you know, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to have them leave as soon as possible. That's kind of like a weird value proposition. And so kind of reimagining what that could look like, right? Could that be kind of a gym in a box? Is that more of like a coffee kind of Starbucksy thing with Wi-Fi and other things, right? That's like another kind of frontier in this, is for those places and situations where you need to charge that's not your home or work or groceries, like going out doing a thing, kind of reimagining what goes on in those places if you have to stay there for between 30 minutes and an hour.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think to me anyway, the takeaway that I'm getting is really what you said there, Tony, earlier, is we got to get away from the idea of reinventing exactly what we already have, because we're transitioning to a completely new concept, a completely new system, and the old version of popping in, popping out, you know, going to the bathroom and being on your way and grabbing a sandwich and eating it in the car or whatever, it just is not going to work. It's not going to work. So that's good that you and other smart folks are out there trying to think of how we're going to make America more like France. Because it just reminded me when I used to live in France, you know, that it was illegal to eat food in your car. It was fine to smoke, but you weren't allowed to eat food in your car. So all the truckers, they had little cafes at every truck stop, and all these guys stood around talking and smoking and drinking their coffee and everything. And it was, I don't know, probably union required that they spend 2 hours standing there doing that. So who knows? But it'll be interesting, and it's a whole new world, you know. And of course, when we talk about perovskite as a technology, soon we'll have the paint on the vehicle subsidizing the energy capture as you're driving. So you're extending your range there as long as there's sunlight. So we might see this issue becoming diminished anyway, as we find alternative ways to recharge those batteries other than a charging station per se. So
yeah, and I just wanted to add one last thing. I saw just last night a Mitsubishi electric SUV, you know, promo thing on YouTube or whatever, and they had an interesting concept. And I've seen this before. They had an onboard, you know, generator. Gasoline fueled generator, and they only had a 38-mile range with their battery. But the way they touted it was like, oh, you run to the grocery store, you plug in, you top it off a little bit, and then, you know, you pop over to the, you know, someplace else, to the park, you know, to watch the kids, you know, for a while, and you plug in, and so you're always topping off that 38-mile range battery thing, you know, as you run around town. And they were saying that you got like 60 miles per gallon ish, you know, and then if you ran out, you had the gas generator to extend. And I think they had a 400-mile range with the generator. So
that sounds a lot like the Prius Prime. I mean, we have one, and it's got a 35-mile range, which is what I was cracking up when I saw the Ohio being within a 25-mile. So I go there, charge up, then I'm out of electricity by the time I get home, or or whatever. But even when your battery is completely dead, because of the regenerative braking and everything, the vehicle still gets 70 miles to the gallon, you know, from the battery assist, you know, from combined, it typically, if for us, since we bought it, averages about 90 miles to the gallon when they throw in the battery range as well. But so that's definitely an alternative for those of us who live in more rural environments where we're never gonna, I mean, we're still waiting for broadband. You know, I'm not gonna hold my breath that there's an EV charging station at every corner, you know, but this is going to be, I mean, this is an issue. We've got to redesign our transportation system at the same time we're redesigning our electrical grid. So what's that going to look like? How's that going to work? You know, and what problems are we going to create in the interim? Death of drive-through windows. Let's hope, right?
Well, and I want to throw something in too, Jay, to Tony, because I agree with him. I'm ready for a DC to DC pass through. I mean, to me, that's it's when I teach my students, I don't teach them just power generation, power storage. It's how we use power that we've got to change also. But here's the problem coming from academia is we already don't have enough electrical students and electrical people to replace everybody we're losing. We're a candle burning at both ends right now. We're losing the old people and the new people aren't coming in. And so everything everybody's dreaming up is great. I love the future. I'm a futurist, but at the end of the day, that's one of the things that plagues me every day. How do we get more, I don't want to call them electricians as far as technologists, people that understand this technology, that can think outside of the box, that aren't engineers, that can get in here. And the fact that you're asking them to deal with least lethal levels of electricity. I mean, you know, Powin and Connex level battery systems, that's 20,000 volts DC. That's not something light to grab a hold of. So it's great, the future's bright, but I mean, that's the other thing we have to remember. At the end of the day, we don't have enough folks.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I agree with you, Matt. I mean, we're seeing this. I'm sitting here at Zane State Community College. They have trouble getting folks into that. Every trade, I sit on the board of the Electronic Technicians Association. They're complaining, where do we get the new electronic people? Where do we get the new antenna people? Where do we get the, you know, and they all turn to the military. That's the first place they go. You know, we're going to take all these soldiers and turn them into technicians because that's their
They're
mode.
dumb enough to try anything. Use those guys.
I know.
Yeah.
They've got a death wish going. They don't care about the high electricity. So, you know, this is the challenge, you know, which kind of makes my head spin when people complain about immigration. I mean, we need these guys. We need these folks to come in and you know, service this new technology economy. And I think we've seen a head start with the Inflation Reduction Act, where they're talking about prevailing wage as a feature of these incentives. And you start waving $50 an hour pay scales in front of folks, and some of these folks are interested, although that sends them right out of the community college because they're going to get that pay. You know, they're not going to sit in class learning a trade. So now we have to figure out, how do we train them while they're on the job, you know, and how do we effectively get that happening, which, you know, another challenge. I know every person I speak to in the education world, it's an issue. It's a big issue.
And we don't need just installers. We need people that understand this technology.
Yeah.
And
the technology is getting more, it's getting easier to install and more complicated to hook up to get the reporting done. I mean, you spend 3 hours installing a solar array and 6 hours getting the programming done so that it's properly communicating, you know, and all these guys are sitting around saying, I'm not no damn computer programmer, you know. It's like, but that's what we're forcing upon folks. So. Okay, well, I think we're coming right up on our hour, so this is great. I appreciate, thank you, Tony, for all your assistance there, as always. You're a delight to have on board here. So Anyway, we'll see you all next week, same time, same channel. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jay.